We are using as our overall theme for these first few Sundays of the new year how to be a positive influence in a negative world. You may be one of the only believers at your workplace. You may be one of the only believers in your family. We are living in a world that is increasingly hostile to the Christian faith, and so it becomes more challenging for us to be the salt of the earth, to be the light of the world, and to maintain being a positive influence in the negative world. It is a major challenge to stay positive when everything around you is negative. And we don't need to come to church to be reminded how negative things are. We need to come to church to be reminded who God is, and that He will give us the grace and the strength that we need to be able to make a difference in our world. And thankfully, God gave us the book of Daniel and the example of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as to how to maintain a positive influence in a negative world. You know the Bible stories from Daniel, the three Hebrew children in the fiery furnace, and Daniel in the lion's den. And just a review from last week, Israel kept getting further and further away from God. God had warned them through the prophets, judgment is coming, and judgment came in the form of the Babylonian Empire taking Israel captive, and Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor, the king of the Babylonian Empire, had a unique strategy in that not only would he move some of his people into countries he had overtaken, he would take the best and the brightest of their young people and bring them to Babylon and enroll them in a 3-year indoctrination school into Babylonian religion and philosophy and so on. And today we come to Daniel chapter 3. But before we go any further, there were a couple of questions I was asked last week that I need to answer. First question was, how much time was there between Daniel 1 and Daniel 3? And the consensus is about 20 years. Now, we are given enough dating information and historic touch points through the book of Daniel to have a pretty good idea of the time frame of the book. We know, for instance, when the Babylonian Empire came to power. We know when Nebuchadnezzar began to reign. We know when the Medes and Persians overtook the Babylonian Empire. See, sometimes, I think subconsciously, when we read the Bible, we somehow think that it's a parallel universe, that, all this is going down on the earth. In the meantime, in the Bible, this is happening. No, the Bible is a historic book. It's rooted in history. Nebuchadnezzar was a real man. The Babylonian Empire was a real world empire. Cyrus was a real king, and Daniel was a real man. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were real people that lived on this earth. And so we realize that this, that's why the Bible frequently will tell us things like, in the year that King Uzziah died. Because we know when King Uzziah died, because we know history. And so it's very important for us to understand that the Bible is not a book of fairy tales. It's not just a book of interesting stories. It is a book of historic accuracy rooted in history. And so we know from our study of history that the Babylonians considered that you became a man when you were 20. And so some believe that if that's the case, probably Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken captive when they were about 17 and enrolled in that 3-year Babylonian indoctrination school, so they were about 20 at the end of Daniel chapter 1 when they started serving the Babylonian Empire. And if it's been 20 years between Daniel 1 and Daniel 3, that means that these, quote, 3 Hebrew children are actually about 40 when the events of Daniel 3 happen. So we need to start calling them the 3 Hebrew middle-aged men. Although that just doesn't run off the tongue like the three Hebrew children does it? Although I will tell you that the further and further I get away from 40, the more 40 seems like children, right? So you will hear me call them the three middle-aged, the three Hebrew children, but they were really the three Hebrew middle-aged men. So all the Sunday school teachers have to go out and redo all your artwork for the three Hebrew children, and wait till we get to Daniel 6, and we learn that Daniel was probably about 70 when he got to the lion's den. So, it just blows up everything in our minds. But the second question that I was asked was, why isn't Daniel mentioned in the story of the fiery furnace? Surely he would not have bowed to the idol. Why isn't he in the fiery furnace also? The Bible does not give us a sentence that says, and here's where Daniel was, meanwhile, back at Daniel's place. But there are a couple of possible explanations for this. One is that Daniel was promoted to a higher position than Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We know that's true from chapter 2, verse 48. Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. So Daniel is way up there. He has earned Nebuchadnezzar's trust. He is at the top of the food chain of the Babylonian government. And some believe that therefore Nebuchadnezzar felt that he could trust Daniel okay, and that Daniel did not need to bow down to the idol. However, if you keep reading chapter 2, in verse 49, it says at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. So Daniel and the three Hebrew children are not stationed geographically in the same place. Daniel is in the capital city at the palace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are administrators spread throughout the province of Babylon. And so there's a good chance that Daniel wasn't anywhere around when this idol was made and the fiery furnace happened, because either Nebuchadnezzar had sent him, somewhere else in the empire. It was a massive empire, on a mission for him, or perhaps more practically, because Daniel was situated in Babylon, and chapter 3, verse 1 tells us that Nebuchadnezzar set up this idol in the plain of Dura. And the best we're able to look at the geography of the Babylonian Empire, the plain of Dura was about 95 miles southeast of Babylon. So it's not like from Martinez to Evans. The idol is set up in the plains of Dura, and if Daniel is in Babylon, he's 95 miles away. So if neither of those explanations help you, you go do your own searching and find your own answer. But it seems to me that Daniel was not at the area where this particular event is taking place. He's at the palace in Babylon serving Nebuchadnezzar. So we come to this familiar story where Nebuchadnezzar builds this idol. 90 feet high, 9 feet wide. That is a massive idol. And he sends out this order that all of these various government officials have to bow down when the music plays at the dedication of this idol. Verse 4, the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of all of these various instruments, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard that music, All of the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And some people noticed that they were still standing. And so, in school and at work, there's always the tattletales, So these tattletales go to the king and they say, you said everybody had to bow, but these Jews that you brought over here, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they aren't bowing down and they're not serving your God. So verse 13 says, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the image of gold I've set up? Now, and then he gives them another chance. You do realize you're always given more than one chance to do wrong, right? I mean, the devil will give you another chance. Let's try this again. And he says, okay, when the music sounds, you're supposed to bow. And he says, if you don't worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? And they reply to him in verse 16, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you set up. So once again, Nebuchadnezzar, the word furious is used. His attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie them up and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, fully clothed, are bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent, and the furnace was so hot, maybe you didn't know this part of the story, that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers that threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace. And the 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? Certainly, your majesty. But look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound, and they had been tied when we put them in there, and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. You got to appreciate Nebuchadnezzar's flexibility. He then approaches the opening of the furnace and he shouts out to them, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So they came out of the fire. And all of these government officials gathered around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched. And here's the real miracle. There was no smell of fire on them. You remember back when you could smoke inside and you'd go into a convenience store? You couldn't go into a convenience store and come back out without smelling like smoke. These guys are in the fiery furnace and they don't even smell like smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him. They defied the king's command. They were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, maybe I better get on his side. I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. And then the king promotes them in the province of Babylon. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm impressed by that kind of faith. I need that kind of faith. Don't we all need that kind of faith? As we face the fiery furnaces of life, we need that kind of faith. So let's look at what we can learn from this very familiar Bible story. The first thing we learn, we already know because we've lived long enough to learn it. Fiery furnace moments will come. You know, as the guy said, Mama said there'd be days like this. She just didn't say there would be so many of them all in a row. I saw a poster one time that said, I try to take one day at a time, but lately several days have ganged up on me all at once. And we all know that feeling of just being overwhelmed. So Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 4, dear friends, do not be surprised at the painful trial you're suffering as though something strange were happening to you. I think we would handle the challenges of life a whole lot better if we just realized there are going to be challenges in life. You know, Peter says, it's nothing strange happening to you. You're living a Christian life in the midst of a non-Christian world. Don't be surprised when trials come. I mean, take faith out of it. You live life on planet Earth that has been affected by sin. Don't be surprised when tests and trials come. These young men weren't looking for trouble, but it found them. And how many times in your life have you just kind of gone along minding your own business and all of a sudden, wham, you end up in the furnace? But here's the thing about the furnace. Those fiery furnace trials often come when we are already weakened. Do you ever hear the statement, don't kick a man when he's down? I heard a comic say, don't kick a man when he's down. That's the best time to kick him, is when he's down. You know? And that's the devil's philosophy. In case you've not learned that yet, that's the devil's philosophy. Kick them when they're down. These young men are in a foreign land. They may have been promoted, but they're still basically prisoners of war. They have been uprooted from their family. They've been uprooted from their tradition and their culture. It's been 23 or so years since they've been to the temple, since they've had a rabbi teach them. They're away from their families. They're away from their social support system. And it's been over 20 years. And you know how over time influences wane? You know what it's like when for whatever reason you don't get to church for 2 or 3 months and it's like God seems more distant and faith seems more distant. And here they've been over 20 years away from everything they know. Additionally, they're not close to Daniel now. They may be miles away. It may have been a long time since they hung out with Daniel. And so these are kind of socially isolated from their religious support system, out there on their own when the test comes. And we need to learn from that. The devil sends his hottest fire when you are already weak. You know, he doesn't typically attack you when you're strong and everything's going well. Now, he may, but the attack will be more in the area of pride or something. But when you're physically ill, when you've got heavy burdens on you, when everything's kind of chaotic in your life, that's when the devil says, let's get him. The trials come when we're already weakened. And the hottest fire is in the areas that are closest to us. This challenge went to the core of who they were as followers of the God of Israel. Would they stick to their commitment? I'm the Lord your God. No other gods before me. Don't make a graven image. Don't bow down to idols. Would they maintain their commitment to God, or would they fit in to the Babylonian religious system? It's easier to deal with stress when it's just on the periphery. But when the attack comes at your core, when the tests come at the core of who you are, that's when they're the hottest. You think about the things that hurt you the most. You think about the things that cause you to lose sleep. You think about those things that are on your mind last thing before you go to sleep and first thing when you wake up in the morning, those core values, those things that are the closest to you. That's where the devil sends his hottest attack. The areas that are the closest, the core areas of our lives. And for these young men, it was their faith in Christ in the midst of the Babylonian Empire. So before we get on to the fire, I think we need to back up for a minute and review what we talked about last week from Daniel chapter 1. And that is that faith is grown, Grown, grown and developed. Somebody said you develop faith for the fiery furnace 1 degree at a time. And I think that's right. So that means I have excellent news for you. The trials you are going through right now are to prepare you for bigger trials tomorrow. But that's the way it works. Remember, last week we were talking about the meat that was offered to Daniel and them to eat, and they said no. And Daniel resolved in his heart, Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, I'm not going to eat the king's meat. And we talked about that, and let me just give you a quick review. Why was the meat such an issue? It was a sign of commitment to friendship, and that's not a big deal. But part of the food that the Babylonians ate was unclean, according to Mosaic law. Some of it had been offered to the Babylonian gods and therefore could not be eaten. And the Jews killed the animals in such a way that all the blood drained out because they couldn't eat blood. The Babylonians prepared their food in such a way that the blood stayed in. So the issue was not, I don't like your food. The issue was, this is a religious commitment. My God has given me certain dietary restrictions, and if I'm going to be faithful to my religious commitment to Him, I can't have this food. Now, I imagine that when Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego had made that decision, we're not going to eat this food because it's against our faith, they may have thought, this is the biggest problem we're going to have. And it's over. They didn't know there's a fiery furnace 20 years down the road. And you may remember, we looked at this last week, that the Babylonians couldn't understand, what's the big deal? It's just food. And they tried to explain to them, and remember that the only reason that they were allowed to be exempt from that diet was because the person who was in charge of it, God had caused him to show favor to Daniel. And I know this is a review from last week, but maybe you haven't listened to last week's sermon yet, or maybe you've forgotten it already. When we take a stand for God, when we take a stand to obey His word, people who are not believers will not be able to understand it. Now, some people are just, obnoxious and they're just going to argue with you, whatever. But serious, well-meaning, good friends of yours who don't share your faith will not be able to comprehend some of the stands you take and some of the decisions you make because of your faith. And I think that it's appropriate when we pray for one another, when we pray for our children, when we pray for our loved ones, to pray a prayer something like, God, just as you caused that administrator to show favor to Daniel, show my loved ones favor. When I pray for my family, I pray that God will give them honor and favor in their workplace, with their bosses, with their supervisors, that God will give them honor and favor, because they will be put in situations where their boss won't understand, why won't you do this one time? Why won't you just forget it this one time? And God, please give those superiors the favor and honor to recognize it's okay to give them an exemption because of the kind of person they are. I think I just encourage you. Pray for that for yourself. God, show me favor and honor in the workplace. I know that there will be times I'll have to take a stand that will make me unpopular, but please show me honor and favor as I try to live for you. I believe that's an appropriate prayer to pray. And again, last week we said that a key principle was to make up your mind ahead of time. Daniel resolved in his heart. They did not wait to sit down to the table to decide they were not going to eat that food. They decided that ahead of time. Likewise, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when the music started playing, did not have to say, y'all come here, we need to figure out what we're going to do. The fire was already there. The furnace was already lit. The music was already playing. That's not the time to decide what your stand is going to be. The battle's won before the battle's begun. And they didn't have to call a meeting at the last minute and say, okay, guys, we're kind of in a quandary here. Are we going to bow to this idol or not? They had already made up their minds. They made up their minds 23 years ago when they sat down to the king's table. We're going to stay true to our convictions. 20 years later, when the fiery furnace hit them, we're going to stay true to our convictions. You will be given, as I mentioned, an opportunity to change your mind, and the devil will try to reason with you as to why you shouldn't stay true to God just this one time. So Nebuchadnezzar calls him in. I hear you're not bowing. No, sir, we're not bowing. Well, I can hear the devil, and I don't know if the devil talks to y'all like this or not, but the devil talks to you too. And one of the key things in life is to learn to discern the voice of God and the voice of the devil. The devil will say, you don't really have to bow to the idol, but look, there's a piece of trash on the ground. Just lean over and pick it up, and nobody will know the difference. Oh, you got a cramp in your calf. Just bow down and rub your leg a little bit, and it'll look like you're doing this. Cross your fingers. It doesn't count if you cross your fingers. The devil will give you all kinds of reasons on how you can try to fit in without standing out in the crowd. But they said, no, sir, we're not going to bow. They were very respectful. Your majesty, we're not going to do this. You don't understand. I've got a furnace. Yes, sir, we understand that. But you don't understand that we're not going to bow. We think that our God will deliver us from the furnace. We know he's able to, and we think he will. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow. And this may be one of the most important lessons from this Bible story. Stay true to God regardless of how it ends up. Verses 17 and 18 are so powerful. We know that you've got a furnace. And we know we may end up in there. But here's what you need to know, King. First of all, God is able to deliver us. Hold on to that for your challenges. God is able to deliver us. However, King, we do acknowledge that you do have the power to throw us into the furnace. There are some religious teachings in our world today that if you applied them to this situation, they would be saying, now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you just need to claim there is no furnace. There is no furnace. It's not going to hurt you. There is no furnace. Yeah, there was a furnace. And I appreciate the fact that faith does not ignore reality. We need to understand that. Faith does not ignore reality. We acknowledge, King, you got a furnace. We acknowledge it's hot. We acknowledge God can deliver us, but we also acknowledge he may not. I heard a preacher coughing and hacking and sneezing while he was preaching, worse than I do. And he says, but I want you to know I do not have a cold. I have the symptoms of a cold. Okay, maybe symptoms of some other things too. But, faith does not ignore reality. King, you can throw us into the fire. That does not indicate a lack of faith. It indicates we're going to serve God regardless because God expects us to do right regardless. It doesn't matter what it costs us. God expects us to do right regardless. That statement, if he does not, we're not going to bow. The King James says, but if not. Do you have some but if nots in your life? Yeah, if I take this stand, I might get fired or I might get a promotion. But even if I get fired, I'm staying true to God. In this situation, it might cost me a friendship, but I'm still going to stay true to God. God's greatest pleasure does not come in saving your skin. God's greatest joy comes in watching his children do right, regardless of the cost. It's Job saying, if he slays me, I'm still going to serve him. And please remember, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego did not know how the story was going to end at this point. All of a sudden, they get bound and thrown into a furnace that is so hot that the soldiers who are throwing them into the furnace are killed by the flames. And it's like, oh, apparently God's not going to deliver us from this furnace. But here's the great story. Nebuchadnezzar, who's sitting there watching, sees all of a sudden a fourth figure in the fire. And that reminds us that God will walk through the fire with me. I don't ever have to go into the furnace alone. I don't ever have to face a challenge alone. I don't ever have to face a trial alone. God is with me. He did not deliver them from the furnace, but he did deliver them in the furnace. And he walked with them in the fire. That's true for you too. And I want to close just by talking to those of us who may be in a fiery furnace right now. Whether it's live here at Open Door, or whether you're watching this 6 weeks or 6 months or 6 years from now, and you find yourself at this moment in a fiery furnace. Maybe it's a fiery furnace because of your commitment to Christ, but maybe it doesn't have anything to do with your commitment to Christ. It might be the furnace of health challenges and bad reports from the doctor. It may be the furnace of financial setbacks or business losses. It might be the furnace of mental and emotional attacks. It might be the furnace of trying to stay clean after years of addiction. It might be the furnace of issues that are tearing your family apart. It might just be what you would call the furnace of affliction. I'm not quite sure what all's going on, but it's hot and it's fiery and I'm having a tough time. I want to assure you that God is with you. And as I was thinking about this a couple of nights ago, a question popped into my mind. The Bible doesn't answer it. The question is this. We know that Nebuchadnezzar saw the fourth man. But did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Did they know God was with them? We're not told that. It just popped into my, and the reason I posed the question, I think they probably did at least sense that God was with them, but we don't know. And the reason I posed the question is because I've been in fiery furnaces, and I imagine you've been in fiery furnaces where we couldn't see God and we couldn't sense his presence. And it felt like we've been abandoned. And it felt like our prayers weren't being heard. And it felt like we were all alone in the fire. And I just want to tell you the promise of Isaiah 43, when you walk through the fire, you won't be burned. The flames won't set you ablaze. I am with you. And the promise, whether you feel it or not, whether you see him or not, the promise is God is with you. And I want you to hold on to that. You may feel alone, but you're not. You may not be able to see God anywhere, but he's right with you through the fire. And he is not going to leave you in the hardest times of your lives. We're going to close by listening to a song by the Crabb family, C-R-A-B-B. It's called Through the Fire. If you're watching us on YouTube, down in the comments section will be the link to this particular video. It's got the lyrics to it so that you can see it, although The person that did the lyrics didn't know how to spell adversary and spelled it advisory. So just recognize that it's adversary, not advisory. But it's a great song about God being with us through the fire. I encourage you, if you're watching online, please find that. There's a lot of different iterations of it online, but Through the Fire by the Crabb family. Promise, Lord, that you will never leave us, you'll never forsake us, and you'll be with us through the fires. May we hold on to your promise, I pray. And now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine on you and give you his peace, now and evermore. Amen. God bless you. Go in peace. Hold on.